often much shorter than other forms of literature. Even a long lyric poem is usually no more than 3 or 4 pages long. And they rely heavily on sound qualities for their effect. So lyric poems use the actual sound words make with your mouth, through your mouth, in a way that other types of poetry really don't. So what do we have as what we call the lyric poem nowadays? Well, when we talked about the epic, that was essentially a community enterprise. The epic attempted to express the values and goals of an entire people. An epic enshrined their customs and traditions in a literary form. That's what the Odyssey was trying to do, right? It was trying to establish what a good society looked like through the adventures of Odysseus. Lyric, on the other hand, is intensely personal. There was almost always an individual I speaking behind the poem. It's not a community, it's singular. Now, this I is something we refer to as the speaker, and it's hardly ever meant to be the actual author of the poem. And even when a poem has an autobiographical element, there is some distance, there is usually some differences between the one who speaks in a poem and the personality of the author. Now, it also does sometimes happen that instead of an I, it's a we. This is more rare for lyric poetry. But even in that case, it's still a first person, it's still a personal expression, and that we generally speak as one. What they have to say is a single thing. So there's a unity there in a lyric poem. Moreover, this I, this person who's speaking, is almost always alone. When there is someone being spoken to, that person is usually absent, distant, or silent. What this personal aspect of lyric poetry accomplishes is not only an extreme specificity, this is the words of a particular person, in a particular place, at a particular time. This personal element of the lyric poem's use of the I offers you as a reader to become the I as you read it. As you read the words of a poem, you are taking them on yourself. You become the speaker when you speak the words of a poem. Even if the personality or experience of the speaker is nothing like yours, you can, for just a moment, experience what they experience and express what they express. That's what lyric poetry has to offer. Another quality of the lyric poem is in contradistinction to drama, which we have also looked at. Both tragedy and comedy are the representation of an action. You remember that from our definition of tragedy early on. It's necessarily something in public, and it literally happens on a stage for everyone to see. Lyric, on the other hand, is essentially interior. It's something that happens inside of a person. It expresses what's happening inside of someone's mind. This is very often an emotion, like grief, love, regret, fear, or, as we'll see in a moment, hate. Emotions run very strong in lyric poetry, but it's not always the case. It can also be a philosophy, a certain way of understanding or looking at the world that is being communicated. And even when a poem does depict actions, even public actions in some way, it presents them within the consciousness of the speaker. It's like they're being filtered through someone's mind before you see them. So it still retains this interior quality. And this makes lyric poems economical. I talked before about how the song-based origins of lyric poetry led to its compressions. Lyric poetry is usually extremely short. Some can be as few as 2 or 3 lines. A long lyric poem is maybe 4 or 5 pages long, and an epic or a drama is just getting warmed up. But lyric poetry says a lot with a little. It does this by not only using words to their maximum effect, but also using sounds, patterns, expectations, grammar, and even the white space on the page to communicate meaning. Nothing goes to waste. the sense of being caught inside of a single moment, where you can examine that particular emotion or thought from every possible angle. In that sense, poems are more like pictures or works of art that you look at than like a story that you hear. Even when poems do depict some kind of change over time, they usually jump from point A to point B, leaving you to fill in the gaps rather than following the path smoothly along the line. So there's a sense that lyric poems are limited in time. So these are the main qualities of lyric poetry that we're going to be looking at over the next couple weeks. Now, studying a poem can seem like a lot of work. How could you possibly wring much more out of less than 20 lines? You know, what's in it for you? This seems like an incredible amount of time spent over an incredibly few number of words. So, what do you get out of it? Well, again, we're coming back to that sense of compression that I talked about earlier. Poems are extraordinarily condensed. And this doesn't mean that they're stripped down, like they're only the skeleton of an expression. It's like the whole thing that was big and messy had just been pushed together into its tightest possible space. So it has to be unpacked. Like their words have to do more than just explain something for you the way you would do when you're just talking. A single word can be functioning on 3 or 4 levels at the same time. So what we do when we analyze a poem is we unpack those different levels. We pull them apart so that we can see them individually, and then we can put them back together and enrich the poem. So what does it get you to pull a poem apart like this? First of all, you can find the energy, the engine that propels the poem forward. A poem is as carefully put together as a watch. An analysis is like taking it apart to find out what makes it tick. How does this poem tick? What makes it go? Because a poem without that, you can feel is absent. It's just not a very good poem. So it also helps us identify the poem's value. Through analysis, we not only find out what a poem means, we find out what makes this poem worthwhile. Is it wisdom? Does it have some kind of something to offer us? Is it experience? Something we wouldn't be able to understand from our own perspective? Is it a new sight of something we've seen before? Analysis helps you identify the source of the wit, the poignancy, or the pleasure of a particular poem, which you might have felt when you read it, but only vaguely and never really understood. Okay, so now on to what do you actually do when you study or analyze a poem. Earlier, I compared analyzing a poem to pulling apart with layers. Another way of looking at it is to think of it like looking at something through different sets of colored glasses. Each set is going to reveal, it's going to highlight certain things about the object you're looking at, and it's also going to obscure some other things. Now, what this does requires you to look at the same thing many different times as you put on your different colored glasses. But the picture that you create when they're recombined is richer, fuller, and deeper than it would have been otherwise. Here are some examples of these filters that we're going to apply to a poem. Plot, what happens? Structure, how is it patterned? Sound, how does it sound? Language, how are the words used? Imagery, what do we see? And so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at one particular poem, and we're going to apply some of these filters this poem, it's pretty straightforward, but in other poems, paraphrase is more helpful. So what I'll paraphrase is what would the poem say if it were in regular written prose? If you need some help with this, first identify the sentence breaks, because the lines, most sentences are staggered over several lines. So it can help to regroup them back into a normal sentence format. Then, if the word order has been rearranged, if subjects and verbs are separated far apart, or if they're repeated, try rearranging it into a more natural, normal order. That may help you. And then finally, define any unfamiliar words, so you know what they mean. Now, what a paraphrase of the poem we looked at, might look like, is everyone in Greece hates Helen's beauty. They also hate her smile, especially when it seems to remember her past. No one is impressed by her beauty, even though she's the daughter of the god. However, they might love her if she were laid on a funeral pyre. Okay, so that's what the poem says, basically on its most literal level. Next step, we take it further. What happens in the poem? We take a look at the action of the poem. And the first thing we need to identify is the speaker, who is saying this poem, and what do we know about his or her life and personality? It's the personal I talked about before. Speakers can be more or less distinctive. Sometimes we know a lot about a speaker, and their personality is incredibly important. Other times, it's almost insignificant. Now, one thing I forgot to mention when I talked about all these different filters is that not every filter, not every question is going to yield something of importance. Some poems don't really have any meter to speak of. Some poems don't really have any rhyme. Some poems depend on structure rather than sound effects, and some poems do the opposite. So not everything is going to bring up something of meaning, but we just check to make sure, and that's what we're going to do here. So in addition to the speaker, you need to figure out the occasion. Poems are generally the result of some kind of interruption or disturbance in everyday life. So what has happened to prompt this poem? And also, who is addressed? Or is the speaker talking to someone specifically? And finally, what's the plot? If there's an action in the poem, what is it? Now, applied to Helen, the speaker is an anonymous Greek who has a habit of speaking for all of Greece. And the only thing we can probably deduce about this person's character is that they were probably injured in some way by the Trojan War, which would have been the source of that hatred for Helen. The occasion is the sight of Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world. This is what he or she is thinking as they look at Helen. And as for plot, there isn't much in the way of action. It's really just a pure expression of hatred. This is almost straight up emotion. There's no real action here to speak of. For the third step, we're going to look at structure. And structure is kind of a vague word. It can be a little intimidating. All we're looking for here is patterns, whether on a very small level or on the level of the whole poem. So the first question to ask is, what are the divisions in the poem? How many parts are there? Where do the breaks come? And what is the climax of the poem? What is it building up towards? Once you've identified those basic big divisions, what changes occur within those divisions? Is there a change in grammatical form? Is there a change in address? Do they stop talking to one person and start talking to somebody else? Is there a change in agency? Does the action change in some way? Does the subject change? Does the tone change? And tone is the speaker's attitude towards its subject. What kind of changes take place within the divisions we have? Now for Helen, we've clearly got 3 stanzas. Each stanza is one sentence exactly, so the sentences coincide precisely with the stanzas. That's not always the case. In fact, it's relatively unusual. And the climax is really in the last 3 lines when they describe, well, they might love Helen if. That's where the poem has been building up to all this time. And some changes in this structure because the last stanza seems to have a shift in tone. It doesn't seem quite the same as the other stanzas, not only because it changes from the insistence on hate to possibility of love, it also moves from looking at the living Helen to the image of a dead Helen. And the speaker's attitude towards Helen seems to shift a bit in that last stanza. So that's one thing to notice about the structure. Step 4, we'll look at the meter. So what is the rhythm of the poem? Rhythm is the stress pattern of the poem, and we talked about this when we talked about Shakespeare. Shakespeare's basic pattern is the iamb, which is unstressed, stressed. So his lines went da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Is there any kind of rhythm in this poem? And when you look at that in combination with the length of the lines, you get what's called meter. The rhythm plus the line length is what's generally called the meter of the poem. Now, Helen is a free-verse poem. That means it has no set meter in any way, and that's what it means to be free verse. But there is a pattern, there is a rhythmic feel to the poem if you look at the study of the stresses. There's a pattern of really heavy stresses, especially at the beginning of every stanza. Now, I only did this for the first stanza, probably because it's all that fits. But take a look at this. All Greece hates the still eyes in the white face, the luster as of olives where she stands, and the white hands. So there are some patterns in the rhythm here. First of all, those 3 heavy stresses at the beginning. Every other line has 2 stresses, so it's a 2-stress line, but the first one has 3. Other patterns we can see in the rhythm is the 2 heavily stressed syllables right together. Still eyes, white face, white hand. Okay? And then you're kind of surrounded by unstressed syllables. A final thing to note about the pattern of stresses is that these stressed syllables are almost always single words. They're not syllables in a word, they're complete words on their own. The only exception to that is that middle line, where you have the stresses falling on the syllables in the words. In fact, that's the only line where there are any words of more than 1 syllable at all. So that's something that's worth noticing, and that's what you see when you look for the rhythm of this poem. And this pattern is repeated in those other stanzas if you take a look at them more closely. Step 5, now we're going to look at other types of sounds, including rhymes specifically. So, first of all, look at what words rhyme. Are they connected in some way? What is the rhyme pattern? Okay, if the rhymes are repeated in some way, that are usually labeled, like, for example, A, B, where A are rhyming words and B is a set of rhyming words. So identify the rhyme pattern of the poem. And then finally, what other sound effects are there? Are there any repeated vowel or consonant sounds that we can look at? So in Helen, we have quite a few rhymes. Hates and face, which is not exactly a rhyme, it's very close. Stand and hands, reviles and smiles, an unusual rhyme. Still and ills, unmoved and love. This is a conventional rhyme. Move and love have conventionally rhymed since the Renaissance, when they really did rhyme. And made and laid. So when you look for a pattern in these rhymes, there's 2 pairs per stanza, and then the first 2 lines of every stanza rhyme. When you look for repeated vowel or consonant sounds, what you find is there seems to be repeated S sounds in the first stanza, repeated W's in the second stanza, and repeated long vowels in the third stanza. For example, leaves and feel. Okay. sentences does the poem have? Are there predominating parts of speech? For example, a poem can be noun heavy or verb heavy. And then look at the individual words. What words are repeated? Or what words form chains of relationship in some way? And then finally, what diction is being used? And diction is sort of the way word choice reflects a certain register of speech. For example, you can use very fancy, flowery words, and you can very simple, plain words. You can use jargon, or you can use a dialect of a specific, or of a particular kind of person. All of these would be choices in diction. So let's look at Helen. As far as sentences go, it's got 3 sentences, 1 stanza each. We've talked about that. The sentences have the same structure every time, especially at the beginning. They always begin with the subject Greece and then a direct verb. And then the description of what it is that Greece hates or reviles or sees. So 3 parallel structured sentences. I don't really notice any predominating parts of speech, just that the sentences have that repeating structure. There certainly are repeated words, white especially, and then paired with wan. The word white appears at least once in every stanza, and wan, which means pale, is kind of associated with white, and is even paired with it at one point where it says white and wan. As far as chains of relationship, we see it, when we look at the words in the poem, we can see a chain of nouns, of body part nouns. You start at the beginning, you start with eyes, hands, face, feet, and knees. Okay? So you're working with various parts of Helen's body, and that's the kind of chain of relationship I'm talking about when we look at the language choices. And as far as diction, the only thing I noticed that some were commenting on was this line, remembering past and change. And that one seemed a little odd because the diction of the rest of the poem was so straightforward. In fact, as we noticed when we looked at the rhythm, there's really heavy use of single-syllable words. There just aren't that many multisyllabic words. Now, if you look in the second stanza, you've got reviles, that's a 2-syllable word, hating, 2 syllables, and deeper, 2 syllables. And then you get remembering, 4 syllables, and enchantments, 3 syllables. And that's the first time you get these long, complicated words, and you revert almost immediately back to the single-syllable words, simple diction, and past tense. So this one seems to stand out because its diction is different from the diction of the rest of the poem. And the next step is to look at imagery. Now, images, as we talked about before, are representations of something that you can experience through the senses. So, what images are used in the poem? Are they describing material or immaterial things? Is the image meant to describe something you could see or feel? Or is it using something you can see or feel to describe something that you cannot see or feel? What is normally associated with those images? That may not be the same thing as what's associated with those images in the poem. Is there some kind of progression or connection between the images? How do they change? Do they repeat each other? Do they revise each other? Do they replace each other? How are they connected? And then look for anything unusual or striking about these images. What isn't normal about the way these images are used? So, in Helen, we've got the images luster as of olives, the white face and hands, still eyes, cool feet, slenderest knees, white ash, and funereal cypresses. These are all the things you can see as you read the poem. And they're all descriptions, except for the last one, of a physical person. So there is, in fact, a connection in that they're all tied to the same central figure, except this this last one, which is sort of set apart. What is normally associated with these images? Well, olives, of course, is associated with olive oil. It's a sacred oil used to anoint. It was also used not only for cooking, which probably isn't relevant here, but for beauty. Right? You put it in your face, in your hair, and it would make you shine. And that's what it's talking about as far as the luster goes. White is associated with purity and illness at the same time. So white kind of has two different sets of associations there. And finally, the cypresses. Cypresses are a dark tree and the tree of death. And obviously the adjective there, funereal, emphasizes that traditional association with cypresses. So, as we noted before, there is in fact a progression, a connection between these images, because they're all describing the same person, except the last, and they're all describing a physical thing. There also seems to be some similarity in the sense of lack of movement. For example, the eyes are still, and the feet are cool. That seems to be an unusual sort of way to describe feet. They're clearly not feet that run or dance. These are feet that hardly even move based on the adjective used here. And that's one of the things I noticed that was unusual or striking. The other thing I noticed was this notion of slenderest knees. It would in fact have fitted better with the other images if it had just been slender knees. No, it was slenderest. What makes these knees slenderest? Why was it important that these be the best of their kind? For example, why wasn't it coolest feet or whitest face? Why this in particular to be used in that superlative? So those are the things we notice when we look at the imagery of the poem. Finally, we take a look at kind of a grab bag of other ways of looking at the poem. What is new? What's striking? What's imaginative about this poem? What catches your attention? Why would you stop when you're reading and think? So just kind of consider that about this particular poem. Does it belong to a particular genre? A lot of poems are a particular type, and there's lots of poetic types. Some of them have to do with structure. For example, a sonnet, which is always 14 lines of iambic pentameter with a specified rhyme scheme. Others are genres of subject. For example, an elegy is a poem written to mourn someone who has died. There's all kinds of very specific types of poems, and if this belongs to one of those specific types, it will perhaps recall those other poems that were also written about the same subject or in the same structure. And finally, consider the roads not taken. Remember that everything about a poem is chosen. Every word has been carefully picked. So why did the author do it this way? Why didn't she do it differently? Why didn't she leave off that last stanza? Why didn't she say this some other way? We did that briefly in thinking about the option of slenderest. It could have been different. Why isn't it? Why this way, specifically? And sometimes that can yield some interesting observations. So when you think about what's new or striking about this poem, here's what strikes me, at least. It's not the hatred so much that's a surprise, because we picked up on that both in Agamemnon, the play, and to some extent in the Odyssey. Both of them seem to have a very understandable resentment of Helen. So even though that first line kind of hits you like a ton of bricks, the hatred of Helen is not a surprising emotion. What seems to be surprising is the stillness in response to her beauty. There seems to be no movement towards her beauty, no admiration of her beauty. And in fact, it says Greece stands unmoved by her. And that's unusual because normally the hatred that beauty inspires is because of the destruction that beauty inspires people to. Because of beauty, people act, people are reaching after it, people want it, and therefore it causes all kinds of devastation. But there's none of that movement here. There's none of the reaching after, there's none of that destruction. It's very still. It's a quiet poem. But it ends it is obviously heavily dependent on classical allusion. And allusion is a reference to a story or a background that the reader is assumed to already know. So by titling the poem Helen, the author is assuming you know who Helen is, what her backstory is. So this is a poem of classical allusion, as are the two others that you'll be reading in Homer. And when I think about the roads not taken, one, she could have explained the reasons for the hate of Helen. There's nothing about, because she killed my father, or because I lost my son, or because she destroyed my city. There's none of that in the poem. Why didn't she include the reasons for hating them? Another possibility is she could have saved the hate for the end. It starts from the very beginning. All Greece hates. You're hit from the start with it. It would have been interesting, but very different poem, if she had described the beauty of Helen, and then in the last stanza kind of burst forth with the hatred for that beauty. But she starts with the hate. That's the first thing that she wants you to know about Helen. That's the first thing she sees, even before she sees her face, is the hatred that Greece has for her. And it also couldn't have been less universal. Both of the first two stanzas start all Greece. So instead of creating a specific persona, a specific individual who hates Helen for concrete reasons, this person who's speaking is at least purporting to speak for all of Greece. Why is that? Why is there a communal aspect? So we've answered all of these questions, and so we've got all of these bits and scraps of observations about this poem. Now, our job is to put them together. But that's not what I'm going to do now. I want you to think about what we have, the observations that I've mentioned, the answers that I've mentioned. See if you can come up with different answers or additional observations, and see if you can start to use those scraps to pull together some thoughts about Helen. What makes it tick? What makes it work? Where is this poem going? What is it saying? See if you can start to put these pieces together and see how it uses these different layers to build towards that single moment that the poem is trying to capture. And then we'll talk more about that in class. And I'm going to ask you to apply these steps, these questions, to a couple of other poems, which we will also talk about in class. If you have any questions about this, or if you need some help with it, by all means, I'm happy to do that. But I hope you'll enjoy the other poems as much as I like this one. You like that?